listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you and welcome to The Briefing. What's your reaction when you hear a trigger warning? Does it make you want to listen further or just turn off completely? And how are they linked with informed consent?
I think we have gotten to such a saturation point with them that most people will just ignore them now because they don't need them and it doesn't worry them.
That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Wednesday, the 28th of May.
Tara, welcome back. Good morning to you listening. We're starting today with some news that impacts everyone, apparently. Nearly every Australian over the age of 12 has forever chemicals in their blood. A national survey carried out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics between 2022 and 2024 tested the blood and urine of Aussies nationwide, checking nutrient levels for chronic diseases and PFAS chemicals.
Yeah, and it found that 85% of the population tested positive for three of the most common PFAS chemicals, while older Aussies tended to have the highest levels. Now, that's obviously because they've lived longer and also because they don't really break down. The ones that do break down, they then produce other forever chemicals in the body that don't. So, a bit of a lose-lose situation there, I'm afraid. Now, men generally had higher amounts of the chemicals found in their bodies than women as well.
Yeah, and concerningly, one type of chemical was found in 98% of the population older than 12 years old, another type in 96%. So it's probably in you and I, Tara, unfortunately. Now, just to give some background on PFAS, basically it's a class of manufactured chemicals. It's been used since the 1940s in a lot of industrial and consumer products. So think things like stain and water protectors for carpets or other materials like non-stick cooking surfaces, kitchenware and firefighting foam.
Yeah, and while there's currently only a limited amount of evidence that's showing forever chemicals cause disease and other significant harm, there are some studies that have found associations between PFAS and certain diseases. So the old correlation, not causation just yet. But basically, they've so far found an association between certain chronic disease biomarkers and PFAS levels. For example, there were higher levels of one forever chemical found in people with abnormally high total cholesterol and diabetes and so on, with some studies also suggesting certain types could be possible carcinogens. However, that's not to say that PFAS in your system will cause cancer, as we don't quite know if the amounts in our blood is enough, but hopefully more time and research into that space will tell. Now, we've actually looked into PFAS a little bit more. We will chuck a deep dive that we did into this topic in the description.
A pathologist is flying to the Northern Territory this morning to perform an autopsy on a First Nations man who died while being placed under arrest at a supermarket yesterday. Police say the 24-year-old Alice Springs man had an altercation with a security guard after he was seen placing items down the front of his clothes. Assistant Commissioner Travis Worst says the man assaulted the guard before two plainclothes police officers came to security's aid.
The male behaved rather aggressively and was placed onto the ground by those police officers. He was later identified as losing consciousness.
After that incident, the man couldn't be revived and he was later pronounced dead, with the incident now being treated as a death in custody. It's not yet known whether the officers were on top of the man at the time, but that'll all form part of the ongoing investigation. Now, just quickly, I had a look at the stats in Australia between 2023 and 24, and there were 104 deaths in custody in that year, 27 in police custody or related operations, so I'm guessing that's what this one will fall under. Of those, 76 happened in prison, 24 were First Nations people. That's over a quarter of those deaths. 80 were non-Indigenous. Now, why we point that out is in Australia, Indigenous Australians make up around 3 to 4% of the overall population, yet they make up around 36% of people in our prisons. They are well overrepresented.
Yeah, and this is something that the country is by no means proud of, and our rates are actually among the highest in the world in terms of Indigenous incarcerations. It's been long pointed out that there's a bunch of reasons that need addressing. You know, there's deeper societal issues here that really need to be tackled, and that's why we have things like Closing the Gap. These are things that try to go to the root of why we're seeing such overrepresentation in our prison population. It was something that I kind of touched on yesterday with a social justice advocate when we were talking about adult crime, adult time, and just this idea of overrepresentation in our system. And to be very clear, we're not alleging that there was any wrongdoing in this case in the Northern Territory. We're not alleging that the police officers or the security guard did anything wrong. It's far too early for us to say anything, but it's just important to place this story in the context that surrounds it.
To New Zealand now, where a teenager has died after suffering a serious head injury during a private game of Run It Straight, the viral collision sport where two opponents run at full speed toward each other. One person often left flattened on the ground and commonly knocked out. Now, the 19-year-old was critically injured while playing the high-contact game with mates on Sunday, and he passed away on Monday night.
New Zealand police say while this was an impromptu game among friends that wasn't planned or officially organised and won't be treated as a criminal matter, the teen's death highlights the inherent safety concerns of Run It. Tara, you did a deep dive looking into this sport earlier this month, and a death like this is something that, you know, the neuroscientist you spoke to, Dr. Alan Pearce, he ultimately warned was only a matter of time.
You get a acceleration and a deceleration. So think about being in a car crash and you're wearing a seatbelt, you hit another car, you still keep moving forward and then you move backwards. So, you know, there's the potential for quite a bit of damage to the brain in these sort of events.
Yeah, and just to follow up on what Dr. Pearce was saying there, basically, if you think of your brain like a bit of a ball in a jar, you knock it and your brain's going to knock around the jar. Your headgear does nothing. There's actually no protection that can prevent this type of thing. And he also said that we're seeing really alarming rates of brain damage. He works at an organisation that actually inspects the brains of former athletes, and he'd said that they're seeing now related mental disorders like CTE, depression, suicidality, coming up later in life in players or people exposed to head knocks through footy and games like that. So a game like Run It Straight would presumably be tenfold because that's the entire premise of the game. Now, we have also heard from the official organisers of the game Run It. A spokesperson says that the teen's death was tragic news. They said that the game should only be played in highly controlled environments that include professional medical supervision and support.
More and more city dwellers are moving to regional Australia as the cost of living continues to bite. New stats reveal 25% more people are moving from capital cities to the regions rather than the other way around, and they were up 40% last quarter compared to pre-pandemic levels. Regional Australia Institute CEO Liz Ritchie says it's a clear sign governments need to plan for more regional migration.
We need to make sure that we know where people are moving and actively investing in housing and wraparound soft infrastructure to support that.
I agree, and I rate this, by the way. I'm a city girl, but I lived regional for 6 years for work, and I absolutely loved it. It obviously varies greatly depending on where you go, but a lot of the places are cheaper. Housing, absolutely, unless you're near the ocean. But generally, it's still going to be cheaper than your Sydney, Melbourne and Brizzies. The downside, though, there is still issues with regional airlines and other forms of transport, so I do agree, if we're seeing these stats, we really need to start building the housing and infrastructure to actually go with it so people can move there more easily and still travel for work, leisure and visit family and so forth.
Elon Musk, he is a real-life superhero conquering Mars.
And while we were speculating last week about whether or not Australians despise Elon Musk enough to stop buying EVs last week, we now know some of us hate him enough to try to stop his company building in one of our capital cities. Residents of Adelaide, or Radelaide as I know they hate it being called, have rejected a proposal to build a Tesla battery factory in the city's south, with 95% of the nearly 1,000 submissions sent to the local council citing anti-Tesla Tesla and anti-Elon sentiment.
Oh, 95%, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But hey, the state's premier and the local council say the development represents a major industrial investment. And while Marion Council is yet to make its decision, it says the site would help create 100 full-time jobs, bring more Tesla-led training into the city, as well as $56 million in economic output.
Yeah.
Factors, it says, outweighs any geopolitical or symbolic criticisms expressed in submissions.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned the submissions again there, Tara, because I went through these submissions and the council actually had to censor some of them. So I'm just going to pull out two of my favourite. One person cited opposition to the proposal, citing because Elon Musk is a redacted human being and a redacted exclamation mark. Another person wrote, we should not support and put money in the pockets of a redacted who openly redacted, salutes and is redacted human.
It's not even about the EVs or electricity or the environment. It's just about hating Elon. Oh my gosh.
Look, I will give credit where credit's due. There were some people that cited environmental concerns because this is a big open green space that they want to build on. But yes, the bulk of the people who wrote in these submissions did express very strong language when it came to the tech mogul.
Naughty, naughty. We need to get the swear jar out for these people, I think. Naughty rattlators. Now, that brings our headline to a close for today. Coming up next is Helen Smith's deep dive, looking into trigger warnings, why they exist, whether they work, and if they're overdone. Have a listen to that up next.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here. Before we get into this chat, we do discuss strong themes of trigger warnings. You might have heard us pop a trigger warning just like that at the start of an episode before. And we're not the only ones. They're used throughout all forms of content across social media, podcasting, radio, TV, and movies. But do trigger warnings actually work? How did they become so widespread, and who decides what needs one and what doesn't? Victoria Bridgland is a researcher at Flinders University whose PhD looks at the emotional and behavioural effects of trigger warnings. Victoria, why do we have trigger warnings?
So trigger warnings are pretty much just like a content label to advise that something negative might be upcoming. So you could see them on TV, probably see them on social media. They've gotten pretty general now. They used to be more for a specific sort of clinical population. So the origins of trigger warnings is within PTSD literature, which says that, so the term trigger, which is that if you encounter something that's similar to a traumatic event that you may have experienced, this stimuli, so it could be like car headlights reminding you of a car crash, may trigger you and remind you of a traumatic event. And so trigger warnings actually originated in the very, very early days of the internet, where people were sharing traumatic stories with one another on feminist message boards. And out of courtesy for one another, users on these websites would use trigger warnings to alert users that something in this may contain a trigger that, reminds you of one of your traumatic experiences. So they were sort of within this very specific, zeitgeist / internet bubble. But of course, with, internet spreading around and social media and everything like that, they started to spread around the internet. And so they started to spread out of this very hyper-specific context with probably users that knew each other in this close community to just exploding all over the web and people using them for all kinds of negative content. So now today, you won't just see them for these very specific sort of just trauma-related things. You'll see them for just any kind of negative content, whether it's like something that makes you just feel uncomfortable or something that could potentially, trigger you in more of the clinical sense of a trauma memory. We also see them widely associated with other sort of clinical disorders as well. So eating disorders is another one where there's a lot of trigger warnings. But yeah, basically they're just a warning to give users a heads up that something negative might be upcoming. So you can do one of two things. You can then avoid the content that you're going to see, or the claim goes that you'll be able to mentally prepare yourself to cope with it better if you're warned than if you're not warned.
Okay, so do trigger warnings work to stop people from clicking on a piece of content, or do they actually do the opposite?
So all the lab-based research that's been conducted so far says trigger warnings are, in a nutshell, not very effective at doing anything. I'm very, very confident about the mental preparation claim that that's not a thing. So when you see a warning, you do not sit there and get some kind of toolbox out in your mind to mentally inoculate yourself to encounter negative content. It's just not happening. And the avoidance, they don't also seem to promote avoidance. So people overwhelmingly will say things akin to, I'm really morbidly curious about that now, or it spiked my curiosity. That's the most common response we get across the board when people see warning messages. There will be a very slim proportion of people that will say that they will avoid the content, but it's only a very tiny amount. In most studies so far, those people aren't what we'd call quote unquote high risk. In the studies I've conducted, at least, we don't seem to find that those people are the avoiders. The avoiders just seem to be, in fact, in one of my studies, the avoiders were people who were actually more psychologically well than the people that were not avoiding. In some cases, actually, when you're in like a negative headspace, this may actually drive you to seek more negative content for a variety of reasons. And so I don't think, for those people in particular who I think are quite a high-risk group of people that are like voluntarily, in some cases deliberately seeking out negative content to fuel a negative content binge online or fuel a negative mood, I think those people definitely aren't benefiting from trigger warnings, and they're probably the high-risk group that we really care about.
You touched on some of this before, but what kind of content usually gets a trigger warning and how is that decided?
There's no hard and fast rule. It's just sort of the law of the internet as to whether someone will decide whether something has a warning or not. I know some like media organisations might have maybe guidelines or something, but users just will pick and choose what they put warnings on. I mean, anything that could be potentially seen as negative, or even stuff that's neutral, but somebody may perceive it through a lens that may be negative. So, for instance, I know in the eating disorder community, it's very common to just put any label to do with anything to do with food, it gets a warning, because food could be a trigger for somebody with an eating disorder. They put the warning on there.
I've seen this argument and kind of conversation around trigger warnings almost being a type of informed consent. For example, like before a movie, you get the movie rating of, is it PG, is it M? So even if they don't work, is that a reason to still have some kind of trigger warning?
Yeah, the informed consent thing's interesting because if you do look through like the historical origins of warning messages, we do get it from informed consent. There was like a court case, I think it was in 1957, where someone didn't give consent for a medical procedure and then they ended up having a really disastrous outcome, and then it went through this whole court battle, and informed consent was like born as we know it today. And then we get the film warnings, which you just touched on. That's the next in the timeline in terms of our warning culture timeline. And they came out after the Hays Code was abolished. So the Hays Code used to be this like morality code that would say what could and couldn't be on the screen, basically. And in order to give like movies a better shot and directors and things a better shot at being able to actually show the spectrum of human emotions and human events and needing to show negative things. And they got rid of the Hays Code and they replaced it with the warning system instead. So you could make your own choice. And it's that whole idea of like giving someone choice. But I'm seeing more and more people online talk about this informed consent thing with a whole bunch of different things. Like, I didn't consent to, having that experience, or I didn't consent to this or that. It's quite an interesting argument. I think it might fall under the banner of this illusion of efficacy. So like you assume that if you have the choice with a trigger warning, you're going to make the right choice, when the studies would say you're probably not going to make a different choice than if you weren't warned. But people like having that choice.
How do you measure if a trigger warning works, and what did you guys find?
You can split it into two sort of outcomes that have been studied in my research and in others as well. And the first is that sort of emotional outcome. So it's a pretty classic two-group experimental design. One group gets a trigger warning, one group doesn't. You show both groups some kind of negative thing, and then you measure their reactions to see whether or not it reduces their negative reactions towards whatever they see. Across the board, across several labs, across several countries, there's never any differences between people that are warned and people that aren't warned on outcome measures in emotion. And then the other outcome that we focus on is avoidance, which has been studied in a few different ways so far. You give participants two choices and one of the choice has a warning on it and one doesn't, and you see which one they choose. Or you see you give them a warning and see who opts out of that study at that point, drop out in the study. But across the board, across that, we do see that avoidance is quite low. Some studies, the avoidance has been as low as 6%. In my studies, when we give people options, particularly I've done a lot of stuff on those warnings they use on Instagram, those blurred screens. I've done a lot of studies on that. And people typically, it's like 80 to 85% of people will want to know what's underneath the photo. Even though we show people really nasty images and keep showing them the nasty images, like across our studies, like 50% of people will uncover every single image we show them. And they're horrible images as well, like dead bodies and all kinds of horrible stuff. And people will just keep looking. And then you ask them why, and they say it's morbid curiosity because they've got this blurry screen and they want to know what's underneath because it's like intriguing, even though they know it's going to be bad. Even though it's not going to lead to them feeling better, it's going to lead to them feeling worse. But yeah, it's this morbid curiosity thing that we have.
Yeah, humans are very curious, and I guess that's why we're talking to you and asking about if they actually work. But there's a lot of people who might even be listening that might get frustrated by trigger warnings, saying that, as you mentioned before, they're so widespread and they're on everything now and every piece of content has them. What would you say to that?
I think for the most part, like if it's not affecting you, I guess just try and proceed with your day and not let it bother you. I think we have gotten to such a saturation point with them that most people will just ignore them now because they don't need them and it doesn't worry them. I guess the harmful aspect of that is they're becoming so non-specific. It's hard to know if you were really using them to avoid and they're on everything, what would you choose to avoid and what wouldn't you? I think there's probably a detriment in overusing them. Like maybe they should only be used in certain cases where it's necessary, and then you have more of a signal as to like what might actually be really bad and what might not. But then you'll have the opposite of people as well. So if you are one of those people that uses trigger warnings to avoid absolutely everything and you can't cope with seeing online content and it does actually really affect you, that's a really clear sign that, you know, you might need some kind of further professional assistance or therapy or coping strategies to help you sort of be able to cope with, seeing negative content and things like that.
Is there anything you'd like to see change about trigger warnings? Is there a perfect way to have one?
I always say that because I sometimes use them in my own teaching because I teach about certain sensitive topics, but I always give like an anti-trigger warning. So I'll say like, this is the content that it's going to be, like it's going to be on this topic. Definitely avoid like emotion words. So don't tell people what they're going to experience. So just a clear like content label of what it might be. But then I always have a little thing underneath that that's like, I know that this warning isn't going to change how you're going to feel. And here's stuff that you can do. So here's like the university support team that you can go to if you need help. You can come and talk to me if there's something that you want to like, you know, reach out and get some more extra support for. But yeah, don't just leave people with the trigger warning because essentially I think if you're leaving people with the trigger warning, you're leaving them with no help at all. And I do also sometimes think it gives people a pass to just present content in any clumsy way that they may present it, rather than thinking about how you're delivering the content. If you just go, oh, well, I've got my content and I'm not going to change the way I'm presenting it, I'm just going to put a trigger warning on it. And then if you're offended by it, it's your fault because you've opted in. Instead of thinking about the ways that you're actually delivering content or presenting it, is there a way that you could present something negative in a way that scaffolds it and makes it accessible to people that don't think that they would be able to initially cope with it?
Victoria, thanks so much for coming on The Briefing.
Thanks so much for having me on.
That was Victoria Bridgland there from Flinders University and the College of Education, Psychology and Social Work. Before you go, if you could rate and review The Briefing podcast wherever you're listening to this ep from, it's a really easy way you can support us and everything we do here at The Briefing. Thanks for listening. That's it for now. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 4. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.